What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you some first impressions for Banquet for Fools, an interesting indie crpg from Hannah and Joseph Games, which is set to release in full just a couple of days from today, having spent the last year and a half or so in early access. I've been excited for this pretty much since it came onto my own radar, as I had previously played interesting games by them like Mecha Jammer. But to get some stuff out of the way, I am bringing you this first impressions video from the early access period of the game. The reason I decided to go ahead and do that is the fact that the launch version will not drastically change anything so much as it will just add in the last bit of content that is currently missing, alongside quality of life stuff, things like that. And so what you're playing right now in the early game of early access isn't really going to change much. In any event, however, I actually bought this game when it released into early access. I paid the $20 for it, which is still what it's going to cost at release, by the way. And I could tell right away it was something that I really wanted to dig into when it launched in full. A big reason for that is while I would of course consider it a CRPG, the developers describe it as a party-based brawler. And the reason for that, I would say, is the combat system itself is, technically speaking, a real-time with pause system, but it really is kind of doing its own thing that takes a little bit of getting used to. And first impressions wise, what I would try to tell people is that this is the kind of game that, thanks to some of the unique stuff it's doing, takes probably a few hours to really get your feet wet and understand what exactly it is you're doing in a lot of cases. And so let's dig into some of that straight away. Now, if you have ever played one of their previous works, Serpent and the Staglands, you should be familiar with a little bit of this as it takes place within the same universe there. And it is a fairly unique one, unique fantastical races, its own politics, back and forth, the usual stuff, but things are relatively straightforward for us as we are playing a group of volunteer guards. Our job is to help our local leader, called a Pavura, I believe, with a task he gives us. He is about to head out and confront a rival faction in battle, and yet he recently received a report that an entire settlement on an island called Invamona, which you are on, has just completely vanished without a trace. Your job is to find out what happened to them, but obviously things are always a little more complicated than that, because the island we find ourselves on is actually basically the place to farm a lucrative spice. It just so happens that the place is also notoriously difficult to inhabit. Now, along the way, we are going to, of course, confront all sorts of different enemies, come in contact with all sorts of different civilizations, and simply try to help them out, sort of old school RPG style, because this is definitely a game that isn't going to hold your hand a ton, which is one of the reasons it takes a few hours to get to the bottom of the entire experience. Either way, though, shortly after completing the prologue, the first thing you're going to do is create your party. In this particular game, you do control an entire party of 4, and you can customize both their appearance as well as their race. 4 of the 5 races are fairly unique to this game. I would say they kind of got their own thing going on, and then the Yetis are more or less what you would expect, each with their own general strengths, weaknesses, etc. And then you've got a little bit of cosmetic customization on top of that. Probably much more interesting, however, are the stat distributions. Now, if you don't want to get too into the weeds of this straight away, you can just pick an archetype, but let's try to hit the most important stuff. Weapons are more or less what you would expect. So are shields and armor. Where it gets interesting is runic, divine, and binding, as well as instruments. Runic and divine are basically your ability to control the various forms of magic you'll be encountering. There are basically pagan and divine magic, related to your aura and pagan stats accordingly. Now, for the runic side of things, what you'll do is you'll find these special trees out in the world to interact with, and if you have the skills and a spell book, you can just spellcraft little spells that you'll be able to then cast, of course, in combat and the like, and that's kind of how they do that. Divine is a little different because that's your intercessions skill. This involves tracking down the statues of old gods and communicating with them via this skill, and then performing some task they want you to do, which will then unlock that shrine and allow it to enchant your gear. Now, the catch being is that you have to have the appropriate skill level to use the enchantment on that gear. And if you don't meet it, it'll just be a regular weapon for you otherwise. And that's some of the ways the game interacts with things in a unique way. Binding allows you to use like charms and stuff to tame wildlife rather than fight with it necessarily. And then there are things like instruments. These are pretty straightforward. This allows you to essentially play a bard that will buff or debuff party members and the enemy accordingly. So there's some fun stuff going on there straight away. Now it is possible to lockpick and sneak and steal your way through towns as well, though I will say that does feel a little poor in terms of like its actual combat applications. It's useful enough for sneaking around town, mind you. Either way, once you are done controlling your party of 4, then we can get to the good stuff, mainly combat. Now, combat is the thing I think that's going to throw people for a loop with this game because, again, it takes some getting used to. Because it is a real-time with pause, party-based brawler. What is that about? Well, basically, depending on your weapon and setup and your own stats and everything, every few seconds you'll be able to make an attack. This can be a basic attack, yes, or it can be one of the actions associated with whatever else you got going on. You know, cast spells, use an item, that type of stuff. However, where it gets interesting are your techniques, because in the early game you might find yourself just making basic attacks and that kind of being it. However, one of the progression systems of this game, outside of your individual party members leveling up and getting stronger as you go, is actually your group-wide technique screen. These are going to unlock some like fundamental things you are going to need in order to engage with combat effectively, such as some really important group tactics. In fact, Form Up is one of them. One of the tactic systems of this game allows you to separate your party into different groups and then use the skill Form Up. Form Up does pretty much what it says. Forces your characters into a certain area for some bonuses. You can also unlock things like dodges and parries, and dodges here are an active element. That is something you have to like physically dodge out of the way on your end. And so what starts off almost hands-off becomes a more interactive experience the more of this technique page you start to fill out. And that even includes things like special attacks, charges, kicks, but also more interesting stuff like rallies. Sometimes, as you build up a meter, you can do a rally attack, which is effectively like a big wind-up that can do up to like 3 times damage. Sometimes you even get like a special little attack display for it. But I'll be the first person to tell you this just takes some getting used to. Then there are other elements that make this game a little trickier to play in the modern era because it's definitely old school in the sense that it doesn't like giving you things like a journal or clear directions even. It gives you enough, however. You do get things like, a proper map, local, as well as a map of the island itself to kind of navigate the individual cells you find yourself in. And there are certainly a bunch of quests you'll encounter along the way, but the catch is you'll have to either make notes or simply remember all of that stuff yourself, including a bunch of like puzzles and things you can get to the bottom of as you make your way across the island, because the game's not really going to do that for you. It's also possible, as I mentioned, to do things like sneak around town and mess around with like the justice system, if you will. So you are able to like steal things and everything. The catch being is that it will be possible to get a bounty put on your head, and if you type in bribe and like physically say it out loud in the game, you'll have the opportunity to pay it off. But each individual settlement even has like proper little schedules for all the NPCs, even if it's not like a super sandboxy type of system or anything. That's before we start talking about things like crafting, other little side systems like resting, leveling up, etc. Later on, you get to actually sail around in a boat. There's some water traversal as you make your way around the island and everything, the story itself, of course. And so combining all of that together, Banquet for Fools is just doing a lot of really cool stuff that I think is interesting. And that's to say nothing of the art style, which I also think is really great, which is obviously why I knew I was going to cover this game straight away. But to set a sort of baseline here, while I am going to review this game, it does launch in full here in a couple days, so I'm definitely not going to have the review out for that specifically. However, there is a demo available if you want to try some of this stuff out for yourself and see if it's for you, and I'll be working on the review in the meantime. With that said, I do not think I am going to do a 100% review for this one, for a couple of different reasons. For starters, I don't think they're planning on achievements for this. I haven't seen that anywhere. But even if they do, I don't, again, know that I'll bother to frame it that way simply because of the type of game this is and the way everything is kind of like hidden and meant to be a secret, etc. I'm just not sure it really fits the context of what the game is going to be, but also because they have expressed some interest in continuing to work on the game after launch. That is to say, working on more updates, potentially a DLC, depending on how the game performs, etc. And for all those reasons, I just don't think the moniker quite fits here in this particular instance, but regardless of what I decide to do, I will be reviewing this for sure, one way or another, and I'm pretty excited to actually play through the whole thing finally. But in any event, that's pretty much going to do it for today. If you're looking forward to the full review of this one, certainly like, comment, subscribe, and stick around for a little while, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.